cheap oil will come at a cost for the US. A lot of analysts are looking at this market and starting to feel very bearish about the direction that oil is heading. This presents a lot of interesting kind of changes and challenges for the US. One of the interesting sort of second order effects that you start to see outside the borders of the US, oil exporting countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE especially, these countries are really scrambling for options to diversify their economies away from being so dependent on oil revenue. But of course, the sort of ironic thing about that is that they need oil revenue in the short term to fund all the investments that they're making in tech and AI. I think that the reason you see OPEC countries wanting to produce more despite that kind of pressure is because they're really concerned about maintaining market share. There's only a few markets left globally where oil demand is growing. So there's a kind of growing competition to seize market share in the few places where that growth is still happening. And OPEC countries are willing to accept a lower profit margin if it means being more competitive in these new markets and trying to kind of get the oil price down to a point where it's going to hurt US producers more than it hurts themselves. The other really interesting dynamic, there's been a real reluctance over the last few years to really strongly enforce oil sanctions on Russia because there's this fear that if we sort of completely cut Russia out of the global oil market, it's going to jack up prices for everyone around the world. When the price of oil starts to go down a lot, I think you will see a lot more political sort of willingness and ability to put more sanctions pressure on Russia. Of course, though, at the end of the day, is a low oil price good or bad for the US? If you're driving a car and you see the price of gasoline go down at the pump, you might be happy about all of this. On the other hand, the oil industry is one of the most important sectors of the US economy. They're obviously negatively affected by a lower price. And so there's a real question, I think, about is the net benefit of losing that tax revenue from oil production, losing jobs potentially in the oil sector, the sort of impact that you might see for oil, which is still such an important part of the US economy, could that potentially offset the consumer savings or inflationary kind of situation for gasoline prices? And which one is really better for the US? This is a calculation that President Trump and his team are going to have to think very carefully about the pros and cons, both domestically and for foreign policy, about how to navigate this price. You can tap the link in our bio to read more and subscribe to Semafor's Net Zero for your inbox.